let's say that we use the term of equality, or someone uses the term of equality. What is the first thing that comes to mind? So you're faced with an SJW who comes and talks to you, and they argue with you, and they argue against your point, and they want to tell you that somehow what you are saying violates equality. What is the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, this is from my own experience. So obviously, it's not necessarily typical of most people, but I know that the word equality is used because it's got interpersonal significance. If the dynamic between two people is unequal, then normally it's seen as a sort of bad thing on a social level. But when it's applied to a society, it's actually a sort of beating stick to get resources out of people who you don't know, you don't interact with, and it's just a means of people grifting in a political sense, in that they're saying the word equality and relying on the positive connotations it has because it's more appropriate to use it in an individual setting. And most people look at politics through that lens, don't they? They kind of analogize their interpersonal relations to society or to politics more generally. And so they're relying on that positive sentiment to then do something more insidious and sort of a sleight of hand of switching out what seems like fairness, but it's actually not. It's stealing other people's resources that they have no right or claim to having in the first place.
If you ask me what's the first thing that comes to mind, like literally the first image that pops into my mind, like a Rorschach test, it's probably like a sans-culotte from the French Revolution with one of those red hats on, like a big-nosed Gallic Frenchman.
Yeah.
An unwashed peasant wielding a meat cleaver, screaming, égalité, fraternité, égalité, something like that springs to mind.
It does have sort of French Revolution connotations, doesn't it? I mean, of course, that slogan that you said is one of the ones of the French Revolution, right?
A poor person just screaming bloody murder, literally. Because they're not rich and there's a rich person they could kill. But the other thing that sort of springs to mind, at least nowadays, is someone like, I don't know, Kamala Harris or AOC, sort of just deliberately muddying the waters between equity and equality, just deliberately trying to bamboozle people into stealing their money. That's the end game, isn't it?
So I think that one thing to notice here is that what you're referring to seems to me to be the conventional meaning of the term equality, or at least the conventional meaning of the term of equality in some circles. We could say in conservative circles. It happens, but one of the things that seems to me to be flying under the radar is that we didn't pose to ask equality of what. And I include myself into this because I want to show that what these false assumptions about language are assumptions that I think we tend to make, and maybe there are psychological pressures to make. I'm sure you will have a lot to add on this.
Oh yeah.
But we didn't pose to think equality of what. We rushed to think and to assume that the concept of equality captures one thing and one thing only.
Well, sort of a social freedom or money.
Yes. So
we just assumed that, didn't we? I suppose you're right.
So a really interesting question would be equality of what? Is it equality of rights? Is it equality of resources, equality of income, equality of wealth, equality of opportunity, equality of status as a citizen, as we see in Aristotle, for instance, and the care for the free and the equal in ancient Athens, wherein the equal in terms of money, they were the citizens. It was an issue of status. So I think that one of the things that is really important is to ask ourselves, what is it that we mean when we use a term? But also, what is it that other people mean when they use a term? And I think that we should constantly be more demanding of ourselves and others. And instead of finding ourselves dragged into the framing effect, where people want to frame us and want us to basically answer and give yes or no answers to questions that they formulate in a very sneaky way and very devious way, I would say, we should constantly be qualifying And I think we should constantly ask of ourselves, what do we mean by this concept when we use it, instead of just using it carelessly in the way that we don't like people to use it. When, for instance, we dislike people who uncritically throw notions like that without supporting them, intellectually speaking. But also we should be a bit more demanding of other people. So we should we should ask them, no, what do you mean? In what sense do you mean this term? What do you want to capture with it? So I think that it is very human to make these assumptions, and it is very human to make the assumption that language is static and that there is only one meaning of a particular concept, which is the conventional one. But it's more messy. And this is a difficult thing to digest, but I think it's a very important thing to digest, because the more we start thinking about it, our thought will be completely transformed.
Spoken like a true philosopher. I mean, that's something Socrates could have said. What do you mean by that, though? But
Exactly.
what are you saying?
Exactly.
Yeah, it is very helpful. It's sometimes annoying, actually, but helpful. It means you get to a higher resolution version of what. When you write, I think when you're writing, it seems to me more obvious than when you're speaking. So when you're speaking, you have a conversation in real time. It's quite a quick back and forth exchange. But when you write something down, like whether it's an essay or an article, or actually quite often if you try and write fiction, you realize, if you sort of have any sort of introspection, you realize, what is the person that's reading this, though? What image are they going to have? So say you try and describe a scene, a fictional scene, and you describe it. Obviously, you've got an image in your own head, and you try and describe it as best possible. But you've then got to think, what image is the person that's reading this going to conjure in their own mind?
Yeah.
And the reality is that each person will conjure something sort of unique for themselves. Now, the same happens in a conversation, but it's easy to forget or skate over that because it's such a quick back and forth usually. An actual debate is a bit different when one person speaks for a long time, then the other person responds for a long time. But in a normal conversation in the pub or something, you speak over each other and you speak past each other very easily, very, very easily. You didn't stop to say, wait, I just need to make sure you're actually using you've got the same concept in your mind that I have when I use this one word. I mean,
I think in that case, though, normally you would have a bit of a disagreement, or like someone would bring a presumption that would take you a bit by surprise, and then you kind of walk it back. So, wait, what do you mean by such and such? But yes,
sometimes you have to, though, don't you? In a conversation, sometimes you realise, oh, that other person is talking about something completely different. We're using the same word, but you're obviously thinking about something completely different to what I'm talking about.
I thought it was quite interesting that you brought up these sort of differences and similarities between written and spoken language, because typically written language is more consciously constructed, isn't it? And therefore you're using different parts of your brain, and you're thinking in different terms, more or less. And so it makes sense that this is going to be perhaps a little bit more focused on the perceptions that are going to be brought to the table. Whereas when you're having a conversation, if you take long pauses to really think about what you're saying, unless you're Jordan Peterson or something who will sit there in silence, most of the time someone's either going to interrupt you or they're going to think, wow, you're a bit slow. And I think lots of people fear that they look foolish. And I don't think there's actually anything wrong with it. But at the same time, I think we have the inclination to fill the void with noise, just so we seem attentive, because if we just sit there in silence as well, it also seems a bit impolite that we're going to just subject that person to our own sort of indulgent introspection before we speak. There's a sort of inherent impoliteness to it that I don't necessarily agree with. It doesn't have to be rude, but people see it that way, and therefore they're a bit less inclined to do so. But to return quickly to your example of equality, part of the reason that I brought my presumption to that is that I think it's a false concept. I don't think there's such a thing. It's a fool's errand to pursue it, that there's nothing equal in the world. Everything is kind of has its own differences. And so the only context in which I really approach it is in the political sense, which is why I brought that presumption. Had you brought a different word, perhaps, and you could bring more solid and objective definitions of it, and perhaps a more objective understanding, if that's even possible.
When you say it's a false concept, do you mean that it makes no sense? Or do you mean that a whole number of propositions that involve the notion of equality and are really frequently used in political debates are false?
Both, actually. But
Okay.
yeah, I just don't think that there's such a thing as equality. I think it's a social construct that doesn't really apply very well to the real world.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.